Now, this video is going to be all about building a base for a classic woodworking workbench. Now the completed bench will have a tool tray, 2 vices, and I suppose you can call this like a hybrid style robot workbench, taking some aspect of the classic robot design, such as the mortise and tenon joinery and relatively hefty size wood, but making it in a bit more of a manageable way. Now to start with, this bench is made with rough sawn hardwood. The base will be made out of oak and the top maple. And first up here is milling the pieces for the legs. A classic robot style bench has really hefty legs, measuring about 5 by 5 inches. Now, while we like the size of that, I mean, if you go that route, it really requires a huge amount of wood, especially if you're using wood from a regular lumberyard. Most rough sawn pieces at the lumberyard is going to be cut at about 2 inches thick. And by the way, this wood is from a local family-run place here in Virginia called Hackett's. I love those kind of places. And when you mill that down, jointing and planing, you'll be lucky if you'll get 1 7/8 inches or 1 3/4 inches out of that when it's all flat and ready to be used. So if you double that up to glue legs together, you might get 3.5 inches, which is exactly what we're aiming for here. Now, 3.5 inches is still a good sturdy size without using a ridiculous amount of wood. And if you were using framing lumber here, you could get 3.25 inch square, which is also a good size and would be a lot cheaper if you wanted to go that route. And we've used framing lumber for several workbenches in the past. This will be the first hardwood one. So nothing wrong with going that route, especially if it's your first bench. You can see here that one of the legs required 3 pieces to glue up, as the individual boards were a little bit thinner. But the other pieces were thick enough to require only 2 pieces for the glue up. So once you've milled up your glued up legs, this is when you get to the final dimensions. And you know what, it's easy to underestimate just how much work is required in milling up and preparing the wood for a bench like this. It's just a lot of wood. And even with nice tools like we have, it takes a fair amount of time to get to this point. Now let's look at the design for a minute. So this bench will have 2 legs with tenons going into the top, whereas the tool tray will rest on the other 2 legs without any tenons. And this means that 2 of the legs are longer than the other 2. Each leg will need 4 mortises cut, 2 for the short rails and 2 for the long rails. Now the first thing to do once the wood is milled up to size is to mark out every single mortise so that you can get a visual reference. We decided to make the short rails the same size as the legs, 3.5 by 3.5 inches. However, the long rails will be 1 7/8 by 3 3/4 inches, so a bit more narrow and like longer. Basically, it seemed unnecessary to use as much wood for the long rails, as this will still provide a lot of mass with enough space for large tenons going into the legs. And here is where one of the vices will go. And just marking this out here to make sure that it's not going to hit anything or run into one of the rail tenons. And here, making sure that one tenon is not going to go through into another, inside the mortises. And because they are 2 different size tenons, we really didn't want them to meet inside. Whereas if they were the same size, that wouldn't have been such a big deal. I made a video about setting up a jig to cut mortises, which I'll link in the description. And having a jig like this makes all the difference in terms of getting repeatable results and crisp mortises. It's just nice because the jig takes the measurements out of it. So once you have set it up, it is a lot faster and you'll just get a more dependable result. So the next step is cutting the rails to size and cutting the tenons. And for that, we're going to use a dado blade on the table saw. Another way to cut these tenons would be to stick them straight up. However, these rails were too long, so it was a lot easier to lay them down and use a dado stack. It is important to cut slow. It's really finicky to get right up to the perfect size. So there's a lot of trial and error involved here, and you should really be testing throughout to avoid overcutting. And since there are rails of two different sizes here, it further complicates it a little bit. So what we did here was to start with the short sides, half-inch sides that needed to be removed. And once that was done perfectly, it was time to set up the 3/4 inch sections, being very careful not to flip them in the wrong direction. So here, just cleaning up the tenons by hand and doing some test fitting. And you think it would be perfect with jigs and machines, but the cuts are never quite exact, especially with the router jig cutting the mortises, because every time you make a cut, you make dust and chips which may be blocking the fence, preventing everything to get super precise. Okay, so at this point, all the mortises and all the tenons are cut and the base is ready to be assembled. Oh, I just wanted to take a quick moment here and say big thanks to our patrons for supporting the work that we do here. We really appreciate it and it makes a big difference. And if you would like to become a patron and support the channel, then you can check out the link in the description below. And there's definitely some back and forth in terms of cleaning up a tenon here, a mortise there, to get everything to fit just right. First step is gluing together the legs and the short rails, so we have two sections to work with. These square tenons going into the legs are quite chunky, so you have a lot of glue surface here, so you'll get a really good connection. Now, to attach the long rails to the legs, we thought this would be a good opportunity to use draw boring. And for that we need some dowels. Using some white oak here and cutting these to 7/16 of an inch in diameter. And not using store-bought dowels because they're usually not that strong, whereas white oak is the perfect wood for this. And also, you know, the store may not have the size dowel that you want precisely. So the first step here is chamfering the tenons, and that way they'll have less chance of splitting or breaking off, and you'll also get a little bit of extra room inside the mortise for glue. Now, draw boring is when you drill a hole in the mortise and then you drill a slightly offset hole in the tenon. And then you drive a dowel through, thereby completely locking the joint in place. So using a drill press here to create a guide block, so you'll be able to drill the holes at exactly 90 degrees. Otherwise it's very easy to get it slightly off and then nothing lines up quite right. This is a 7/16 inch drill bit and drilling all the way through the mortise. Okay. Then putting in the tenon and marking out the hole with the drill bit. And then moving the hole a slight amount inwards, about 1/16 of an inch, and then drilling through. Now, it turned out to be almost impossible to insert the dowel through both of the pieces. It went into the first one, but not in the offset hole. So realize that the offset, the difference between where the holes are located, should be extremely small, or it shouldn't be offset at all when you're working with wood this thick. Kind of like when you're working with a timber frame house, they don't offset the holes for those pegs. Especially when you're adding a lot of glue, it slightly offsets it just with that additional mass. So what we ended up doing here was first inserting a smaller dowel, 1/4 inch, to go all the way through the tenon, and then driving in the thicker 7/16 inch dowel, which completely smashed the smaller one in place. So in the end, the goal of locking the joint in place was accomplished. The one thing about this technique is you only get one shot. You can't take this base apart. It's never going to disassemble. But you get a really strong connection, and since when you use a workbench heavily, like for planing, you really want a very stable structure that isn't going to rack. Then just cleaning up the dowel with a chisel first, and then a plane. Also smoothing the sides of the oak, which was really sharp. Now, this bench will have a beautiful figured maple top, and we figured that it would look really nice to stain this oak in a darker gray to contrast the maple. So using a gray stain all over the base, so you still see the grain. So next up here, we're making the workbench top, the tool tray, and the vices, and of course assembling everything together. But that will be in another video. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions at all, anything that wasn't clear in the video. I was trying to be rather informative and really go through the process and provide as much information as possible. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!